This is TWiT.
I'm like a puppy waiting for something to fall off the table.
I mean, honest to goodness, I spend more time writing this. I mean, we go all the way back.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. We talked about growing barley and then malting the barley and then milling the barley, then making the mash, which was, now we extract the sugars from our malted barley, ferment it. Now in comes the alcohol part of the equation. And that gives us our wort, which we've now shipped over into our washbacks. And we have a 7%, you can filter it and make pot beer from it. I don't recommend it. Hops helps. But you're now ready to start to distill. And distilling is an ancient craft. We have plenty of evidence to show that humans figured out that you could take liquid compounds and separate them into their constituent parts with heat. The earliest types of documented skills, the alembic skills, go back to Greek times. And they were typically, you had a pot which they called a cucurbit that would heat up the fluid, and they did make alcohol this way back, several thousand years ago, up into a head where the vapors collect, and then they go down a tube that slopes into a receiver container of some kind, and you cool it down, and you get some kind of distillate. Okay, those are sort of the generic terms. Now, the liquid we're particularly interested in this case is ethanol. And ethanol boils at 78 degrees centigrade. That's 165 Fahrenheit versus water, which is, 100 degrees, 212. So you can heat this mixture of liquid just enough to have the alcohol lift out without lifting the water out. And now we get into various kinds of stills. So the alembic stills are sort of ancient stills, and some of them are still used. Typically the Armagnac process, that early low alcohol level, they typically distill up to 40 or so % to make these early brandies out of old wine. Still use alembic stills. They're very simple. The advanced still, the fancy still today, and I mentioned these in last week's show, the column stills, like the coffee still, are for continuous distillation. Pot stills are batch. You load them, you distill for a certain period of time, typically 5-6 hours, and then you have to clean them out and start over. Column stills are continuous, so you are literally feeding feedstock into it all the time. It's actually two separate columns, one called the analyzer, one called the rectifier, because 19th century names are the best, and they use steam to heat. Steam is actually added into the bottom of the analyzer with the wash coming down from the top through a series of plates, and the heat's applied and the alcohol starts to evaporate, goes out the top into the rectifier where it's condensed and filtered out. Column stills are the modern way. They're often made of stainless steel and are quite a bit fancier. That's where you can get into like making neutral spirits or high rectified spirits, 95% alcohol plus. When you're talking about whiskey, you rarely you don't want to distill that high because it takes all the flavors out. We talk about things like cogenitors and ester ether and polyethyl esters that are flavor that come from the grain. And so you want to distill a little lower. So in the case of whiskey, they use pot stills. And that picture you showed up was a collection of pot stills. This is basically the modern version of the alembic stills, all batch based. Specifically for barley-based whiskeys, most of all, pot stills are copper. And the reason is that there's a certain amount of sulfur that exists within barley. It's a normal part of the plant. And those sulfurous compounds, when distilled, can get quite foul. And copper reacts with sulfur to be able to remove it as copper sulfates. You want a certain amount, but you don't want too much.
I thought it was because it was so conductive for the cooling, but it's actually chemical.
There's a chemical part, and there is certainly the conduction part. Like that's important. And that picture of the pot still you have there. So the lower part is called the pot, and then you have sort of a shoulder region that goes up into the swan neck, and ultimately onto the lie arm. Now, these structures vary from pot still to pot still, and each distillery has very specific designs. And the part of this is that as the condensate comes up in the still and gets into that swan neck, it does land on the copper and cools and will tend to fall back down. They call it reflux. and it takes a certain amount of cycles of reflux to remove the sulfur to the level that you're happy with. Sometimes these stills will have a bulge above that pot they call the OG, and that is, again, giving more surface area for reflux. The shape of the swan neck, how tall it goes, whether it curves or not, all specific to a given distillery. The lie arm coming out. Here you see them coming out horizontally. Some of them tilt up, some of them tilt down. Very, very stylized, and all part of the flavor of the white spirit they're going to generate in the end. Now, after you come out of the lie arm, then you're going into a condenser. So now you're trying to consolidate those distilled alcohols. You can see that coil set sitting there is probably from a worm tub. So that would be sitting in a big wooden tub full of cold water. The distillate would condense out of that through those coils, and that would give you your initial distillation. Now, Scottish distillation is almost always a double distillation process. So you're going to start with a first distillation. It'll take that 7-8% initial wort, and then take it up to around 20 to 30% ABV. There's a bunch of challenges to this. So these first stills, or what they call the wash stills, are larger. They're the bigger of the stills. The spirit stills will tend to be smaller. And the wash stills have windows in them. They call them sight glasses to watch for foaming. How you heat the still matters a lot. In traditional stills, they were heated directly. There was heat underneath the still. Now, there's a couple of problems with that. One is that tends to get very hot, and it can burn the wash in the process. And so sometimes you want those Maillard effects. Some distilleries prefer that effect because they get some toasted notes into it. But you have to manage that very carefully. It's also an explosion hazard. You are making alcohol gas. Yikes. And should it leak from the chamber, you can blow the building to pieces. There's a reason why this is a regulated industry. And so most modern Scottish distilleries today use steam. So the boiler is in a separate building where the fire is, and they pipe the steam to the stills to heat them up. Far safer. You showed for a moment there a mechanical structure inside of a still. That's a stirrer, and it's for direct heated stills to keep the mash moving, or the wash moving around, so that it doesn't burn. But if you're using steam, where you only get to 200 to 300 degrees at most, remember, you're only trying to get to 78 Celsius, just enough heat to be able to evaporate the alcohol off. You don't need to go that high. So your distiller, it's a very active process the distiller is involved in here. As the mash initially starts to heat up, it's going to foam at first. You don't want that foam going up into the lie neck and getting into the distillate. It's a contaminant. So you'll be heating slowly and watching the foam level through the sight glasses. And eventually, as the still heats up as a whole and the mash is to temperature, the foam will die down. And then you can get running to get to temperature to start to get alcohol extracted from it. Now, that's the first wash. That's the first distillation, the wash distillation, and it's going to flow into a holding tank, which they call the low wines tank. And low wines is that 20 to 30% alcohol initial distillate. Now you're going to go into your spirit stills. Very typically same design. They're also copper. They tend to be smaller because you have less liquid involved. There's fewer solids, so you don't need sight glasses and so forth. There's no foaming risk here. But now you're going to heat it up again, and it's going to have that reflux effect. It's going to go up into the swan neck and fall back down. There's going to be a couple of cycles. This is another distillation where the wash distillation probably runs 4 to 6 hours. The second distillation, 6 to 8 hours. And you're going much higher. And those fluids are going to go down into the spirit safe, also known as the intermediate spirit receiver. Now, this is a locked cabinet with clear glass on it. Because now we have to talk about taxes. Oh. So when you're back in the day, you're just making spirits for yourself and maybe selling them. So, of course, the tax man wanted a cut of this. And so lots of smuggling involved. And so The excise tax of 1823 is when they came up with this thing called the spirit safe model. And those locks are controlled by the taxman, by the excise officers to control access to it. And so the distiller actually has to operate the still with remote controls through this. So there's actually this particular one you've got on the screen right now. It's got 3 different points. So the left side would actually be the low wines distillations that comes out of the first the wash still, and then they are basically watching for clarity. So it's going down into what's called the feints tank, which is the stuff they're not going to use. They'll probably use it for a second distillation later on until it runs clear, and then it'll be pointed. They'll turn a little knob and aim that spout into the low wines tank. And then as it gets later in the distillation, particulate will start to appear again, and they'll steer it away. When we get into the spirit distillation, that's at center point, and they're watching for the alcohol level. So we know that ethanol evaporates at 78 degrees centigrade, but there are other compounds that evaporate at lower temperatures, including methanol, the stuff that makes you go blind, and acetyl hydrates and ethyl esters. And so those typically show up in the very beginning of any high distillation, and the alcohol level is substantially higher. So you measure the alcohol level, and if you're running in the 70 to 78, 80%, that's part of the head. You don't want that, and so you'll steer that back into the feints tank. After the head comes the heart. This is the stuff they call new make, the distillate you want, and that's around 71, 72%, depending on the distillery, and they'll put that into the into the intermediate receiver. So that's the stuff they're going to later barrel. Later in the run, hours later, the alcohol level begins to decline. It gets down below 70%, 68, 65%. And that's when you start to get these heavy, oilier compounds that have very strong flavors, and they'll tend to steer that all again over to the feints receiver. Again, in Scottish tradition, nothing is wasted. So everything that ends up in the feints receiver will typically be put back into the wash still to add to the next run. But won't be part of that new make. So all that stuff gets shifted off to the other side, all controlled remotely through these safes. I would point out that today the distilleries have the keys. Not that whiskey isn't taxed. It is. It's just taxed at bottling now, not taxed at distillation. Remember, all of this is a clear spirit, right? All the color we're going to get, it's going to come from the wood in the next phase. But now I get to tell the story of why I selected the Dalmore for our whiskey this week. So I take a tour of the distillery at the Dalmore, and they have their two original wash stills are massive. They're 16,500 liters. Now that's what 3,600 imperial gallons, about 4,400 U.S. gallons, because why wouldn't you have different measures for gallons? Like, what the hell is wrong with gallons in the first place? Did the U.S. pick a different gallon just because it was different from the U.K.? Nah, not that simple. The U.S. gallon is actually based on the Queen Anne gallon, which is an English gallon based on wine. Wine gallons were Queen Anne gallons. At that time, they also had grain gallons, and they had beer gallons, which are different sizes, because why wouldn't you make 3 different sizes, all the same name?
And who wants a gallon of wine anyway?
And so eventually the UK consolidated on the imperial gallon, which was 160 ounces, versus the Queen Anne gallon, which is 128 ounces. Ounces being a measurement of weight or a measurement of volume. Hey, why not both? Because reasons, right? And this is where we get to the whole point about the metric system, right? The French Revolution, like, come on, mon Dieu, you're still beheading your nobles with an axe? When would you ever stop and have wine and baguette, right? It's the French Revolution. Presente de la guillotine. Now you can behead a dozen nobles per hour. Much more time, way more efficient, and you can retire by 62, or is it 64? Before the revolution. Nobody knows. But listen, Cherie, forget about the feet, the pounds, the ounces, the gallons. A 10-centimeter cube holds 1 liter of water, which weighs 1 kilogram. It's just so simple.
So simple.
So in 1874 at the Dalmore, they bought these, at the time, massive 16,500 liter stills, and they didn't fit in the building. The building wasn't big enough for them. And so they cut the swan necks off to get them into the building, and then put a cap on it and attach the lyre arm below the cap, making a completely different looking still. And when they ran them, they liked them. And so to this day, now later they bought another set of wash stills that fit in their building better. So they actually use both sets to combine to make their distinct version of whiskey. They're big on sherry casking, and their fundamental, the one I recommend anyone start with if you want to experiment with the Dalmore, is the Dalmore 12. It's about $65 US. It's got a deep red, rich color. The 15, the 18, and so on up the line get more expensive and all have their own unique natures to them. A lot of that has to do with barreling, but there's nothing quite like the wash stills of the Dalmore. And once you know all the story of that, then when you look at a still, you're like, what's up with that still? And the fact that it didn't fit in the building in 1874 is how that came about.
I love it. And I love the metal deer on the front of the Dalmore.
Yeah. The stag.
The stag. That is awesome.
The famous stag.
So the Dalmore 12 is our recommendation this time. And I'm going to run out to my liquor barn and find one right now. Drink the whole thing, a metric gallon of Dalmore.
Is that an imperial gallon or a U.S. gallon? Nobody knows. It's all confusing. Right. You know what? I try 750 milliliters. Yeah. It's a nice measurement. It's very precise.
It's easy.
It's very simple. It's 3/4 of a kilo. It makes total sense. And so we're now at the point where we have about a 70 to 73% clear distillate, white spirit, ready for barreling. And that's what we'll talk about next week.
Sounds great. All this talk makes me thirsty, but I guess that's the point.